A City in the North by Marta Randall, published in 1976, is a science fiction novel that follows a character named Toyon, who has been obsessed his whole life with a series of video recordings taken by an early human expedition to a distant planet called Hope Haninar. These video recordings show a single continent which is home to a native race of ape-like, expressionless alien beings referred to as the Haninar or the Hanin, which you can see depicted on the cover art here via an illustration by Vincent DeFate. And in these video recordings, the thing that's piqued his interest the most is this ancient abandoned city in the northern deserts of this single continent. And now, as an adult, Toyon has become the owner of a wildly successful interplanetary shipping company, and since he now has the means, he has orchestrated an expedition to the planet of Hope Haninar along with his wife Aline to finally seek out the object of his childhood obsession, this abandoned, ruined city called Tashik. His wife Aline is equally, if not more, successful and influential than he is. She's a few years older than him, and the two form a little bit of an odd couple. They are frequently arguing, they're not aligned on many different issues, but they do have a mutual interest in visiting the planet of Hope Haninar because she is personally interested in the ape-like native beings themselves. So with this mutual interest and their combined resources, they are heading on this mission to this planet where they need to get permission from both the governor of the small human colony, but also more importantly, they need to get permission from the Hanin themselves in order to venture into the northern deserts to explore this ancient city. And this is a privilege which has never been granted before. In this sense, the story reminded me a little bit of Robert Silverberg's Downward to the Earth, which is one of my favourite books of all time. And also I got shades of Planet of the Apes by Pierre Boulle. And not just because of the ape-like natives of this planet, but because of that ancient city, which is an element that pops up in Planet of the Apes as well. So most of the novel follows these two characters as they engage with the governor, they engage with the Haninar, and they set out on this journey across the planet to these distant ruins. And this is something that I absolutely love in science fiction novels, is this epic journey across an alien landscape. And so if you do have any stories that incorporate that sort of narrative, I would be interested in hearing about them because it just does it for me for some reason. Along the way, the two are accompanied by a Haninar who has seemingly been exiled from his own tribe, and much of the book is following Aline trying to communicate with this being in their language while travelling across this unfamiliar landscape and witnessing the ways of the Haninar people. While they're on this journey, they are also being pursued by a couple of villainous figures that I do think were a little bit on the cartoonish side. They were sort of cartoonishly evil, and you don't really get that much time to see them develop as characters in terms of what their actual motivations are. So in that sense, it felt a little bit shallow. I do think the writing here in general was a little bit clumsy and awkward. I would say that the prose quality is just slightly below average. And looking into Marta Randall, she is an American science fiction writer who was actually the first female president of the Science Fiction Writers of America, and she did a lot of editing work on short story collections and anthologies. So in that sense, it does seem a little bit like Marta Randall's influence on the genre has come more through her work outside of writing, because I don't really ever see any of her novels or short stories discussed, and looking them up, it seems like a lot of them aren't really widely read anymore, so it doesn't feel like they've really stood the test of time and transcended the decades that have passed since these novels were written. That being said, I do think that there were a lot of really enjoyable elements to this. I think the Haninar people in general and their ways, and as you get closer to the ruined city of Tashik, some quite interesting themes start to come into play, such as shame and repentance, and possibly even redemption and transcendence. So I think that Silverberg comparison that I made a minute ago goes a little bit deeper than just the surface level of the narrative itself. I think she's touching on similar themes that Silverberg does in Downward to the Earth and many of his other novels. One thing that does pop up time and time again in A City in the North is Marta Randall describing the toiletry habits of the characters. And once or twice I kind of understood she is setting out the practicalities of travelling across an alien landscape and the resulting impact of a lack of comfort for these characters, putting them in an unfamiliar environment, and also building in a really sensory experience in terms of the sights, the sounds, and the smells of this planet. But there is a certain point where she's mentioning these toiletry habits time and time again, where it's like 6, 7, 8 times throughout the book. And it just struck me as a really unusual element and a particular quirk that I've never experienced in a science fiction novel before. I think my other big complaint really is about the ending. You are building and building towards this conclusion, which ultimately just isn't very satisfying, and it doesn't really fulfill the promise that Marta Randall sets out to the reader early on into the book. Like I say, I do think some of the themes that she touches on as the characters near the city are the most interesting part of the book, but you never really get that payoff that you're looking for, or at least I didn't. And combining that with some of the slightly awkward writing and some of the more quirky inclusions, I don't think that A City in the North is a particularly great book. After finishing A City in the North, I jumped straight into The Anything Tree by John Rackham, with a really interesting and cool piece of cover art there depicting this tree with a face in its roots and a blue flower on the cover there. And that is an illustration by John Schoner. And this is a story about a socialite named Selena Ash, who is on a solo space voyage when she detects that there are a number of tracking devices and even an explosive planted covertly on her ship. And so she decides to warp to an unknown solar system and conveniently discovers a hospitable planet which is covered in these dense rainforests. And so she decides to land on this planet, disable the tracking devices, destroy the explosive, and wait for her pursuers to arrive, where she can then confront them on more even terms. And quite quickly, she discovers that the plant life here is seemingly conscious in some way and reacts aggressively to negative thoughts, feelings, and emotions, trapping her in vines, scratching at her skin, and tightening its grip on her body. But then a man shows up who has a bag of soil hanging from his waist, from which a plant is growing that is wrapped around his body, extending up to a single blue flower that is seemingly regarding Selena as if it's some sort of giant eye. And he tells her that if she thinks positive and welcoming thoughts, the plants will release her from their grip and she will be safe to traverse this planet. I don't really want to get too much into the plot of this one or the nature of this Joe character, because this story is only about 113 pages long, but everything kind of centers around the titular Anything Tree. This tree is seemingly calling to Selena across the jungle with a siren-like song that is almost irresistible, and she sets out alongside Joe to visit this tree, which is said to have quite extraordinary abilities, all while eluding her pursuers, who also have an interest in reaching this tree. So it becomes a bit of a race against time, another journey across an unfamiliar alien landscape, and a mystery about the character of Joe, the nature of Selena's mission, and the powers of the Anything Tree. Like I say, this is a short story with really likeable characters that moves at quite a steady pace. Once again, there are some villainous figures in here that are probably on the side of being cartoonishly evil, but unlike A City in the North, there's actually quite a definitive reason that Rackham has written them in this way that I don't want to get into because it is a little bit of a spoiler related to the tree itself, but it does build to a really satisfying conclusion with loads of really cool world building elements about the plant life, about the animal life, and about the backstory of these characters in question. I thought that the questions that this book raises around human nature and the interactions between humanity and other living beings was really thought-provoking, and actually it sort of has this feel of being a first contact story, but a really unique one because the being in question isn't an alien in the sense that you normally get in a first contact story. It is this plant life that does feel truly alien, and the coming together of these two very different forms of consciousness was a flavour that I found to be very unique and very enjoyable. John Rackham is actually a pen name for the English science fiction and fantasy author John T. Philippent. And John Rackham is also a famous pirate, so I wonder if that's where he got that name from. But looking into him a little bit, Frederick Pohl actually credits Rackham or Philippent with a definition of science fiction which he dubbed Rackham's Law, which is essentially saying that science fiction is a method of breaking down reality into its defined constituent parts and then picking out some of those parts and replacing them with new and imagined ones. So even though Rackham is not a particularly well-known or well-remembered science fiction author, the fact that someone with Frederick Pohl's status has named a definition of science fiction after him that he seemingly agreed with, I think speaks to Rackham's ability to think quite deeply about what science fiction is, what it can be, and actually his ability to write, which I do think is pretty good here. Much like Selena Ash stumbling upon this strange and mysterious planet, I do feel like I've encountered a good little hidden gem in the Anything tree. Looking at this, you're probably noticing, or some of you are, that this is an ace double. So an ace double, if you don't know, is a book that presents two stories in one. So if you flip it over, you've got another story to read. And the story on the back here is Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Winds of Darkover. And again, it has a really nice piece of cover art. And I didn't want to read the entire book, including The Winds of Darkover, because I'd read recently about Marion Zimmer Bradley, and some of her actions are obviously horrendous and just weren't really sitting that well with me. Although I'm not really someone that wouldn't read a piece of work just because of the actions of the author, but I'm not in the right frame of mind right now to talk about Marion Zimmer Bradley in any great detail. And also, Darkover seems to be some wider, sprawling universe that this feeds into. And I'm just not sure whether this is a good jumping in point and whether you do need the context of some of the other Darkover novels and stories. If you do know anything about that, please do let me know in the comments. But yeah, two books about journeys across alien landscapes on unfamiliar worlds. One of them not particularly great, but hitting on some interesting themes. And the other one has turned out to be something which I really enjoyed and I'm considering a bit of a hidden gem. And both books have some satisfying colour blocking on the pages there. So that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Thank you very much for watching, liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.